This is William and Lonsdale, a podcast about the legal ecosystem and the fascinating people who make it tick. Today, your host Michael Green speaks with Malcolm Speed, former lawyer and sports administrator. As a sports-mad kid, Mel's focus was primarily basketball and cricket, with a bit of study thrown in on the side. But after some focus in the final years of school, Mel found himself studying law at Melbourne University, with very little idea of what a career in the law could actually look like. After 25 successful years as a solicitor and at the bar, Mel took a risk and opened a consulting business in sports administration, back when many sporting bodies were semi-professional at best. Ultimately, his risk paid off and led to the roles that many listeners will know him for: CEO of the Australian Cricket Board and later the International Cricket Council. But despite leaving the law, Mel's legal skills and thinking held him in good stead and were put to use time and time again.
You've called the job of CEO of what is now Cricket Australia as the best job in Australian sport.
Yes.
In that role, and in your subsequent role, were legal skills an asset?
Yes, they were, particularly given the early experience there, where there's a player dispute, it's about industrial relations, there are threats of strikes, there are threats of we were preparing to, if the players had gone on strike, we were going to issue proceedings against the players and their managers and the officials of the Players Association. So we were right on the precipice of a massive legal dispute. And yes, legal skills came into that. We had issues of defamation around at the time. As we moved on in dealing with things like corruption and chucking and racism and tribunals and rewriting rules and that sort of thing, it was perfect. To be a sports administrator at the top level, you need a thick skin. You can't be delicate, you can't be easily offended, you can't be unduly bad-tempered. And 25 years in the law, I'd developed a thick skin. I'd been beaten up a few times by judges and magistrates and other lawyers, and there's a bit of scar tissue there, and that was valuable.
Our guest this morning on Lives in the Law is Malcolm Speed. Malcolm's had an interesting life in the law in that for the first half of his career he was a traditional lawyer, solicitor and barrister, but in the second half of his career he was a sports administrator and a high-profile sports administrator. And so it's a different life in the law. Good morning, Malcolm.
Good morning, Michael. I'm honoured to be here.
Mel, your upbringing. It appears to me that it was what might be called a pretty typical post-World War II middle-class Australian upbringing. Would that be right?
Yes, Michael. Dad had been to the war for 6 years. Mum had left school early and gone to work, lived through the war years. I was born in 1948, the second child. Everyone was happy to be home from the war. Life was back to normal. It was a pretty basic existence by today's standards, but it was a good time to grow up.
One brother?
One brother, 18 months older than me, Ian.
And what about education? Again, your parents had lived through the Depression. Our generation, our parents did. What was your education and what impact did your parents have on that education? My
mother in particular was very keen for us to have a good education, to go to university. That was impressed on us very early on, I think, before we knew what university was. But I started at Nunawading Primary School out in the back blocks. I used to walk to school as a 5-year-old with my brother, and we'd cross the Maroondah Highway at the lights on our own because there weren't any cars. It was a different time. So then Hawthorn West Central for 2 years while we lived with our grandparents, and Mum and Dad built a house. Then on to North Balwyn Primary and Balwyn High School. So a state education. I wasn't a great student. I was okay. I don't think I tried very hard. I was interested in other things, but I got by until years 5 and 6 in high school when I started to show some promise. So a late developer, pushed a bit by Mum. My brother was a high achiever. He'd gone on to university, so I followed in his footsteps.
When you say interested in other things, would I be right in assuming that was sport? Sport, and sport?
Pretty well, yes. Come home from school. I recall eating quite a lot when I got home from school and going straight down to the local football ground where we played cricket, football, whatever else. If it was athletic season at school, we'd set up a high jump down in the park and we'd be doing that. There were 10 or 20 of the local kids who'd gravitate towards the park, and then you'd come home for tea. You knew you had to be home by 6 o'clock because that was when we sat down for dinner.
I said sport and more sport, but particularly you and your brother Ian were drawn to and more played a lot of basketball, which wasn't that common at the time.
No, it wasn't common at all, and it was quite fortuitous. The local Church of England Boys Club had a basketball program. There was a man there who coached, father of a friend. We weren't allowed to play until we were 12, so I can remember Ian was playing. I used to go and watch him. I was desperate to play. Turned 12 and I was allowed to go and play with the basketball, and it became an obsession. Over the years, played thousands of games of basketball. I was very fortunate at the age of 12. As soon as I started, I was recruited by what was then called Melbourne Church, which grew into the Melbourne Tigers. And my first coach at the age of 12, I had two, in fact, Lindsay Gaze, who was an icon of basketball, multiple Olympian, multiple Olympic coach, father of Andrew Gaze, multiple Olympian, and Ken Watson, who was also the Olympic coach. So at the age of 12, I'm thrust into a high-performing group of young basketballers with the best coaches available. At Albert Park Stadium, I might add, it was the only stadium in Melbourne in those days. 6 courts, 4 of them concrete, 2 of them timber. It was pretty basic, but we look back on that and see what exists now. It was one of those strokes of fortune that happens from time to people involved in sport.
And basketball remained a part of your life up until now?
Pretty well, in that I have several grandchildren who play and they play quite well, and I go to watch them. But yes, it's been I've followed the game. I was involved in administration for a long time after I stopped playing. I played at a pretty good level. I was in junior state teams. I played for the Tigers senior team there for a while. Played with Lindsay Gaze towards the end of his career, and we finished at about the same time. I'm probably 22 or 23, and I moved on to coach Melbourne University, and old age had caught up with Lindsay. But they were good days. They were very formative years for me, and I spent a lot of time at the Albert Park Stadium with an outstanding group of young men. I didn't know it at the time, but with Lindsay Gaze and Ken Watson as the coaches, and they'd recruited very well. Lots of high-performing young boys, and we moved through the ranks together, and most of us are still friends. Those of us who are still around are still friends. We gather once a year and we talk about our exploits, and we seem to get better every year, Michael.
Looking ahead to your career in sports administration, Mel, did cricket play a part in your formative years as well?
Yes, I played cricket again from, I think I was 10 when I started in the under-16s for Canterbury Presbyterian, so I changed denomination. I fielded at fine leg at both ends and only batted if needed. And in fact, I was only selected if someone didn't turn up, but then moved on and played through the juniors. I can recall at the age of 13 or 14, playing in the juniors in the morning, the seniors in the afternoon, opening bowler, left arm, good days in church cricket, playing on matting, and again, a very strong grounding in sport. Played with, as a young kid playing in the seniors, there were a couple of older men who'd played a lot of good cricket, and that was a very good grounding.
We better get back to the law, I guess. University, mid-60s to late 60s at Melbourne University, law school. Any highlights?
Main highlight was they had to pass 21 subjects and I passed them all. I didn't fail any. The objective was to get 51 in each subject. Sometimes I overachieved, and in fact in later years I got a few honours, which surprised me. I think back on those years, Michael, and we think these days of being a mentor for young people. I needed a mentor in those years. I don't know about you, but I didn't know any lawyers I'd never met a lawyer when I started. I made some stupid decisions at university, things like doing family law instead of company law. And I did it because I thought it'd be easier and I'd have a better chance of getting a 51%. And I made a number of decisions like that where I really hadn't been pointed in the direction of what my career might be and what subjects might be useful. So I look back on that and I think it was an opportunity missed. I should have worked harder. It was law was taught differently in those days, but it was an opportunity to, if I'd learnt more law in those days, it would have served me. I wouldn't have had to learn it at a later age, which was more difficult.
I'm not sure I agree with you there, but because you do learn it in due course and you learn it through experience, I guess. articles. Knowing no one in the law, how did you get articles?
One of my basketball teammates, a man called Bill Wyatt, who was a plumber, his brother-in-law was a solicitor, Fred Schillerbeer, who was in Albert Park. He arranged for me to meet Fred. Fred said, come and see me at 5:30 on a Friday night. We went to the pub. We had 3 or 4 beers. He was just checking me out. He said, I can't take you, but I have a friend who might. And he referred me to a man called Darryl Nelson, who was a sole practitioner in Burke Street. And I met with Darryl. I remember at the end of the interview, he said, OK, you've got articles. Turn up on the 15th of January. No letter to confirm it. No, nothing. Just turn up on the 15th of January. And I turned up on the 15th of January and hoped they remembered me.
Were articles structured? Was there set routines for you to follow, teaching you about how to be a practitioner?
No, it was very unstructured. Darryl was a sole practitioner with 2 employed solicitors, Bill O'Day, who went on to be a very good magistrate, and Stan Waits, who was a more senior solicitor. I was gradually given a few files. My main job, Darryl indoctrinated me early, and one of my duties was to park his car. My office was on the way to his office. I had a desk, not an office. And at 10 o'clock every morning, Darryl would drive Judge Martin of the County Court to work. Judge Martin had to be there at 10, so at 5 to 10, Darryl would poke his head in the door, throw the keys to me. The car was parked in the lane next to 2 equity trustees, and I'd have to go and drive it down to the car park and put it there, and then I'd have to go and get it if Darryl needed it. So over the course of the year, I was. Can
I just break in there and just make the point so that people are aware? Those sort of articles were not uncommon.
Not uncommon at all, and I was just grateful to get articles. I was paid $22 a week. Darryl was he was a fine man. He played football for South Melbourne. I think he played about 20 games. He was well known in the Middle Park, Albert Park area. So he was heavily into football, heavily into racing. He had lots of contacts, and he had a really interesting practice, as it turned out. In that first year, I ended up instructing in a number of trials, a fairly big criminal trial, an armed robbery, and I can remember instructing Cliff Panham in an insurance dispute, a young Cliff Panham back in, it'd be 1970. He was brilliant then, and he surprised everyone and won the case for the insurance company. Some very good exposure at an early date. I didn't realise how good it was until later years, but I was really, I wasn't doing the filing and the photocopying and that sort of thing. I was part of a very small team. Then one after the other, Bill O'Day left to go to the bar and Stan Waits left to go to Shell. And I ended up, I think Darryl took all of their good files and gave me the rest. So I ended up with quite a heavy workload of largely litigation, so lots of insurance claims, some personal injury claims, a few contract claims. And one thing that struck me just the other day, I was lucky again in that Jeff Moore, who later became a very good barrister, Jeff Moore QC, he came to work for Darryl on a 6-month locum, and part of his job was to look after me. And that was the first time I'd had any real care and attention from a practitioner like Jeff. He was quite remarkable in those days, and I learned a lot about detail and what went into preparing a case, that sort of thing. So, and I had a long relationship with Jeff and briefed him often over the years.
So, Mel, we're now in 1972. You're 23 or 24 years of age?
23, yes.
23. You start your own practice with Brendan Behan.
Yes.
Why? Why did you do it? I mean, was there no future with Darryl, or did you want to have a crack on your own? Why did you do it?
Oh, both, I think, Michael, and it comes back to the fact that I needed a mentor at that stage, someone to take me under their wing and say, okay, you're 23, you've finished your articles, you've had a year as a solicitor, what are you going to do next? How is your career going to pan out? And I didn't have that. There might have been prospects with Darryl, but I didn't really see that happening. I did want to have a crack on my own. With hindsight, it was foolhardy. 23 years old, knew nothing, had no money. Brendan was the same. He was the same age. We had a few connections. If you look back on that and you say, why on earth did you do that?
And
it worked out pretty well. We had plenty of work. I was based in the city, 9 Queen Street, down the bottom of Queen Street, in a small office there. And Brendan was at Port Melbourne. He was a prominent Port Melbourne footballer. He was quite a good player for Port Melbourne for a number of years there. So he had a local following. The fact that we were 23 years old and knew nothing didn't seem to worry the locals down there. And we built quite a good practice. I did mainly litigation. Brendan did quite a lot of commercial work for local businesses down there. Over time, we both appeared in the Magistrates Court. Brendan did a lot of work at the Port Melbourne Magistrates Court, so he had a good following there. My basketball connections, other connections came good, and word of mouth. It was a strange time, Michael. You could do that. You could go and put up your shingle in the suburbs or in the city, and work seemed to flow in. Some very good work, some not so good work. And I apologise to my clients. I was learning on the job, but generally they seemed happy enough.
Any interesting stories you can pass on? I particularly like not an anecdote, in fact, about an Afghan camel driver.
Yes, Michael, that's quite a remarkable story. It's a long story, so I'll try to shorten it. I'd met a man, we'll call him Jim for the purpose of the exercise, when I was with Darryl Nelson. He was a defendant ultimately convicted of stealing a semi-trailer load of beer with some other people, a conspiracy to steal the beer. He did a year in jail. I'd instructed at his trial. I think Phil Cummins had appeared for him. So he did his year. When he came out, he had an ongoing, what was called a testator's family maintenance case against his late father's estate. And the estate was a touch over $1 million. Now, in 1972, my wife and I bought a house in North Balwyn for $20,000, so $1 million could buy you 50 houses in North Balwyn. It was a pretty significant sum of money. When the father died, he left his estate to his other children and left Jim out. Jim got nothing. So Jim had brought this case. It had been shopped around to various solicitors. Darryl had it for a while. He didn't want it because he'd had terrible trouble getting fees from Jim for counsel for his trial. He just didn't want to go through it again. And I was the last call of Jim's, and I ended up taking it. And I insisted he get 2 days' worth of counsel fees for a QC and a junior. As we went on, the only way he could get anything was if he could show that he was deliberately excluded from the will because of his criminal record, and he was a knockabout sort of fellow who'd been in trouble before, been in fights, that sort of thing, had a few convictions, so his father had excluded him from the will. The only way we were going to get anything was to be able to show that he'd been bullied as a child, he'd been badly treated. As we prepared the case, we needed someone to give evidence about that. He said, well, my mum can give that evidence. Where's your mum? She's in Adelaide. Go and see her and see what she says, and if you think she might help, bring her back. So Jim drove off to Adelaide, brought Mum back. She told me this amazing story, how she'd grown up on a farm in the Northern Territory. This is before the Second World War, so the 1930s. She was the eldest of 4 or 5 children, no mother, lived there with her father. An Afghan camel driver had stopped at their farm with a large train of camels, and the camel trains in those days could have been 100, 200 camels, they were massive. And her father had sold her to the camel driver for £3 when she was 14.
That's unbelievable.
Unbelievable. So I'm there 23 or 24, I'm sitting there with this quite presentable woman telling me this story about her childhood. She'd been then tied to the lead camel and walked to the next town, which I think was Katherine.
And this camel driver was Jim's father, deceased who left the $1 million estate.
Left, yes, ultimately. They get to Katherine, booked into a hotel. She's sexually assaulted in the bath. Thereafter, regularly assaulted on the way to Adelaide, where this man had a farm where he would breed camels. She was left there. She was pregnant. She was left there. He took the camels back to Darwin, came back next year. She's pregnant again. 4 or 5 children. Ultimately, Dad makes quite a lot of money from the camel trading and comes to Melbourne and invests in industrial property out in Campbellfield. Makes a lot of money, makes $1 million. Mum is left behind in Adelaide. The kids come over. Some of the other kids go to private schools. Jim goes to Collingwood Tech because he's dull. Jim's treated badly. So I hear this story from Mum and I think suddenly we've got a case here. Dad can hardly complain about Jim stealing a truckload of beer and getting into a few fights if this is his form and the way he's treated his wife and left her in Adelaide. So I briefed Bill Harris QC and Bill Ormiston, who was then a junior, 2 very establishment figures. They were quite amazed, I recall, when they saw this statement from Mum, and they realised the opposition were treating us with contempt. One of the big firms, this start-up law firm, the 23-year-old, 24-year-old. We went along, no offers, no nothing, and I recall Bill Harris producing Mum and telling them, the opposition, the story about what Mum was going to say in her evidence. We settled on the first morning.
So it had a happy ending.
It had a happy ending, enough to buy quite a few houses in Northbourne if Jim had done that, but he didn't. But it had a happy ending. I'm not sure what happened to Mum. She didn't have a claim because they'd never married.
So you've got an interesting practice with you and Brendan. It's a successful practice with the merging of your two backgrounds. But yet after 10 or 11 years, you leave the practice and come to the bar. Why? What motivated you to do that?
I'd done quite a lot of magistrates' court work. I'd instructed a lot in county court and Supreme Court trials. After 11 years, I felt that if I stayed for another 10 years, I was going to have the same year's experience 10 times. And I was looking for a change. Again, an unstructured career. I liked the drama of the courtroom. I particularly liked the magistrates' court, which was, I look back on that, and that was unusual, but it was humanity at its rawest. It was every day you'd go to the magistrates' court and you'd hear some great stories. You'd see people having the worst day of their life, being brought before the court and their story spilling out. I liked the drama of the court. So I look back on it again, yes, an unusual decision, and you might say, why on earth did you do that? There was no compelling reason to do it other than that I thought it was perhaps the next step for me. I was heavily involved in basketball administration at this time too, but I look back on it, yes, it was an unusual decision.
To go back to that basketball administration, at this stage, are you maybe chairman of one of the basketball bodies?
Yes, at this stage, so I'm 33 or 34. I'm president of Victorian basketball. I was president when I was 30, so I've come up through playing and through different coaching and different committees and whatever. And it happened a lot in those days. Young lawyers got promoted beyond their capability into high-profile sporting jobs. So I'm a volunteer there, but quite a demanding role.
The National Basketball League, as we now know it, didn't exist then?
Didn't exist then. It started in... No, it did exist then. It had started in 1979. In 1987, I was elected as chairman of the National Basketball League after I'd stood the previous 2 years and failed. So I was persistent, if nothing else.
Back to the bar, did you enjoy your time as a barrister?
Yes, I did. I had a varied practice, litigation practice, so a mixture of civil and criminal. Early years, primarily in the magistrates' court, lots of interesting criminal cases. I described it recently. I appeared for a lot of mums and dads who were the only time they'd ever be going to court. Somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. I quite enjoyed that, just getting them through that difficult day. There were some cases were more interesting than others. I had a good variety there on the criminal side of it, with .05s were fashionable there, so I ran a lot of those contests there. A lot of assaults, a lot of shoplifting, you name it, inquests, coronial. I was counsel assisting the coroner on occasion. Lots of committals, those sort of things in the magistrates' court. So a good breadth there. And gradually over towards the end of my time at the bar, so after 5 or 6 years, I gravitated to the county court and had appeared mainly in the county court doing some civil work, some personal injuries claims, but mainly criminal cases, some prosecuting, a variety of cases there. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I ran quite a number of jury trials with varying degrees of success. I loved appearing before the juries. I think that's the most fascinating part of a legal practice, to be standing up before a jury. It's quite challenging. Surprisingly, it takes quite a lot of courage to stand up there at the start of a trial representing someone who may or may not go to jail, and a lot of it is in your hands. A lot of it's is out of your hands. You can't control the evidence, but it's quite a difficult task. And I look back on that. A lot of my practice, I either won or lost, and that was difficult. That was quite taxing. The difference between winning and losing was put quite an emotional toll on me, as it did every other barrister who had that sort of practice. And sometimes we underestimate that.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning, hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting.
It seems like, Mel, you have a problem getting beyond about 11 years in one job, and then you've got to change, because roughly 11 years with Bean and Speed.
Yes.
11 years at the bar, 83 to 94.
Yes.
And then you decide to start your own sports consulting business.
Yes.
married, 3 young kids?
Yes, big mortgage. Yeah. Interest rates probably at 18% or whatever they were in those days.
So why did – and no doubt your income at the bar was comfortable, at least comfortable, if not better than comfortable, paying the bills, and yet you decide to strike out on your own in a sports consulting business at a time when such businesses weren't common.
No, they weren't common, and I recall at the time thinking, well, I might only do this for a year and I can come back to the bar, which would have been dangerous because I would have lost contacts and that sort of thing. I would have had to start again. I had one good prospect. I was trying to set up a basketball league in Asia with another guy from Western Australia, and we had some funding. We had some investors who were investing in that. So that was the first of the consulting jobs, and I needed to add to that to build up a portfolio that would sustain me. So I wanted to give that a chance. If that had taken off, that would have been very profitable, the Asian Basketball League. It didn't in the end, but I spent a lot of time travelling around Asia talking to basketball administrators and investors, and some of them turned out to be crooks, and that was again a challenging experience.
And did you develop enough clients and therefore enough income flow to make it a sustainable business?
Yes, had a lot of clients. They were different days. So this is 94. Sports weren't used to spending money on consultants. Sport didn't have much money in those days. So the AFL and the National Rugby League and cricket and tennis were the big sports in those days. They were reluctant to spend money. And I did a lot of work for the National Rugby League. That was the best client I had. But I did lots of stuff like a review of taekwondo, an investigation for an anti-doping investigation of weightlifting for the Sports Commission, lots of other women's cricket, country racing, different things like that. Ended up with 3 or 4 people working in that business. It was good. It wasn't great. We could pay wages, but it was going to be a long-term. I could just see at the time when I left, it was just starting to turn the corner and the contracts were getting bigger. They were getting better, but I was overcome by events.
And what were those events?
I was appointed as the Chief Executive of the Australian Cricket Board, now Cricket Australia, in 1997. So I was 48 at the time. Those 3 years of the sports consulting had been very good for me because I'd done lots of governance reviews and structural reviews and lots of digging deep into problems within sport. So I'd broadened my horizons from basketball, and I knew a lot more about sport at the end of those 3 years than I did at the start.
You've called the job of CEO of what is now Cricket Australia as the best job in Australian sport.
Yes.
Why do you say that?
There are several good jobs, perhaps 10, maybe 20 now, if you include the AFL clubs or the big AFL clubs or whatever. We see that the AFL chief executive's in the paper every day. Every decision he makes is reviewed and critiqued, generally without asking him why he did it. Rugby League in Sydney is the same, and I very nearly got the job as chief executive of Rugby League in Sydney, which I'm very thankful I didn't get that. Tennis is pretty good. Cricket is important to Australians. The difference between cricket job and the AFL job is you have a team to manage, to promote. You are embedded in the team. You are very involved in the team. Whereas at the AFL, as they say, nobody barracks for the AFL. Nobody barracks for the ACB either, but they barrack for the Australian cricket team. And there are several Australian cricket teams. So for me, as a kid who'd grown up playing cricket and basketball, to have worked in basketball, I'd been chairman of the NBL for 10 years, so I'd had a pretty good go there during a very good period for basketball. Then to come into cricket at the age of 48, I was a fully formed professional sports administrator, if there was such a thing in those days. It's different now that there's a different way of going about it, but it was a very challenging role, and I was very lucky to get it.
As a partner in a two-man partnership and then a self-employed barrister and then a one-man or two-man consulting firm in sport,
yes.
You're self-employed, you're not responsible for a large organisation, you haven't got human relations issues to deal with. Did it take you a while to acquire the skills to be a CEO of a large organisation?
apparently, when I talked to some of the people who worked for me or worked with me, I think it was an advantage. I came into cricket at a difficult time without any baggage. I didn't know the personalities, so I could form my own views. In those days, cricket had a staff of about 35. You're right, I was going from being a one-man band to sitting at the head of the table with a group of professional sports administrators. That was challenging. I enjoyed that. Again, the times have changed. So 1997, human relations, it was important, but it wasn't the way it is now. There was no HR manager. I, in fact, employed one after 2 or 3 years because I could see the need for that, but it wasn't such an issue there. It was quite a hands-on role. It started with a fairly vigorous player dispute where the players were threatening to go on strike and very nearly did go on strike. Lots of ill will between the players and the administration, and I bore the brunt of that.
Because the players thought they were being underpaid?
Yes, and it was the start of the Players Association's involvement in cricket. The players of that time were quite aggressive. They were being underpaid. As a result of those negotiations, a new deal was put in place which has stood the test of time. Cricketers are now very well paid. You could argue they're too well paid, but we can argue that about all of the top professional sportsmen and women across all sports at the moment. But a difficult time. So I was thrust in the deep end with a number of issues that just kept coming up one after the other. So the player dispute, corruption, chucking, racism, lots of issues there, one after the other. So to an extent, you can worry about how you are impacting your other employees, but you've got to get on and do the job. And there were other people there who were managing those people. I was managing the senior management team, so that was my focus. So I think if I'd had a different career before then and been a chief executive somewhere else, I might have gone about it differently, but I didn't really have time to do that.
And is Australian cricket a pyramid structure where you're actually at the top of the pyramid and everything in Australian cricket feeds into Cricket Australia and its CEO?
Yes, and it feeds into the board of Cricket Australia, and it was a difficult board in those days. There were 13 men, there were no women, there was no sign of a woman coming onto the board in those days. I'd go to board meetings at 48, I felt young, so they were old, they were crusty, they'd grown up in cricket, they knew how cricket should be. I recall doing the first strategic plan for cricket, and young administrators these days, they're amazed that in 1998 we didn't have a strategic plan. What did you do? They say, well, what you did is what you did last year and you tried to do it a bit better next year. That was the way it worked. So I can recall sitting down with this crusty board of cricket administrators and telling them we were going to have a strategic plan and they were going to drive it, and they did. And they quite embraced it, and in fact some of them were very enthusiastic about it. They knew that the time had come for it. So they were interesting times, challenging times. I made many friends during that era. I made a few enemies, which I regret. I don't regret it all that much, Michael, but I did make a few enemies over that period.
In that role and in your subsequent role, were legal skills an asset?
Yes, they were, particularly given the early experience there, where there's a player dispute, it's about industrial relations, there are threats of strikes, there are threats of we were preparing to, if the players had gone on strike, we were going to issue proceedings against the players and their managers and the officials of the Players Association. So we were right on the precipice of a massive legal dispute. And yes, legal skills came into that. We had very good advice from Frank Parry, now Frank Parry QC, a very good industrial relations barrister, and some good solicitors there. We had issues of defamation around at the time. In fact, I recall getting some advice from Jeff Sher QC at that stage, some very good pragmatic advice that you'd expect from Jeff. As we moved on in dealing with things like corruption and chucking and racism and tribunals and rewriting rules and that sort of thing, it was perfect. And the other thing I think, from my perspective, to be a sports administrator at the top level, you need a thick skin. You can't be delicate. You can't be easily offended. You can't be unduly bad-tempered. And 25 years in the law, I'd developed a thick skin. I'd been beaten up a few times by judges and magistrates and other lawyers, and there's a bit of scar tissue there, and that was valuable.
Can I just go back to something you mentioned a couple of times, and that's corruption. Corruption being a big issue when you became CEO of Cricket Australia or the Australian Cricket Board. What was the corruption? I mean, I remember, we've heard about corruption over the years with bookmakers in maybe India, I think mainly. Was that the issue?
Yes, that was the thing that drove it, was massive betting on cricket in India, where betting is illegal. So it's unregulated. It's done in back streets, in shops. It's quite sophisticated in some places where there might be, going back before mobile phones were so obvious, there'd be 10 or 20 Indian men in an office with telephones taking bets from all around the world on cricket. Now, what happened in the late 90s, two things happened that influenced it. The captains of three countries, so Salam Malik from Pakistan, Mohammad Azharuddin from India and Hansi Cronje from South Africa, and he was the surprise, each of them was banned for life from playing cricket. So 9 test-playing countries, 3 of them are banned for life. So that was a massive wake-up call that cricket was hit between the eyes. In Australia, we had a lesser issue. Shane Warne, who was the superstar of the era, and perhaps he'd be in the top 2 or 3 cricketers Australia has ever had, he and Mark Waugh, who was a very prominent player, batsman, were implicated with a bookmaker who had paid them money to provide information about team selection and pitch conditions and those sorts of things so that the bookmaker would have an advantage in placing bets. Now, what happened there is that it happened on a tour of the Indian subcontinent.
Mel, can I just break in there? Were you confident it was no more than team selection and pitch conditions and things like that?
I wasn't entirely convinced that we knew the full story at that stage. Mark Waugh was reluctant to speak about it. That was another issue we had to deal with. The board had found out about it. They'd fined the players. They'd covered it up. And ultimately, when I was there as chief executive, it became public. And there was a massive outcry, more about the cover-up than the offence. So it was on the front page of all of the newspapers. The Prime Minister was outraged. John Howard, a big cricket fan, he was outraged. Every article in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald for the next 3 months was headlined "Cricket in Crisis." So the fact that it was Shane Warne was massive. The fact that it had been covered up was massive. What happens in these sorts of situations is there's a public outcry that they want blood, someone has to resign. We actually got through it without anyone resigning, but it was difficult. We had to, I set up an inquiry with a QC from Brisbane, Rob O'Regan, set up an inquiry to look at that very issue. How deep did it go? Was anyone else involved? And things came out. Ricky Ponting had been approached by bookmakers at the Dogs one night, offering him a lot of money to provide information, and he'd rejected it. And we had to investigate all of that and be satisfied that, in fact, it had happened and it had been rejected. But there were plenty of people trying to get their hooks into Australian cricketers. We came through it okay in the end, but it was a very difficult time for me. We had one very interesting legal issue there. The Pakistan government was carrying out an inquiry in Pakistan. Mark Waugh and Mark Taylor, there was an allegation Salam Malik had attempted to bribe Shane Warne, Tim May, Mark Waugh on a tour of Pakistan. That had become public. On a tour of Pakistan, there was an outcry that the Australians wouldn't give evidence at an inquiry. I ended up chaperoning Mark Waugh and Mark Taylor to an inquiry in Lahore.
Why Mark Taylor?
Mark Taylor had said at one stage that he believed everything the Australian players had said, which was perhaps unnecessary, but the press were calling for him to be there. Shane Warne wasn't there. He was injured. Tim May had retired. So Mark Waugh was the only one there, and Mark Taylor was in the firing line.
And he was captain at the time.
He was captain at the time. So there was an outcry for them to give evidence. I organised for a private hearing before the judge at his home. When we got there were 50 media there. We'd been stitched up, and Mark Taylor was very unhappy. We got through it. I was their de facto lawyer. So we've been told that the judge will be there, his assistant will be there, my counterpart Majid Khan from Pakistan would be there, and the 2 players and me. And we get halfway through and Salam Malik walks in. They brought Salam Malik into the hearing. This was part of the stitch-up. So they're giving evidence against Salam Malik, and Salam Malik's sitting there. So Mark Taylor and Mark Waugh were very unhappy. They were very unhappy with me that I'd set this up and that it had all fallen apart. We got through it in the end, but I was sitting there as the chief executive. I was really, I was appearing for these 2 guys. The judge said, well, we'll let the media in now. They can come in and hear the evidence. So I had to object to that. Different other bits and pieces I had to object to. At the end, it was quite funny. At the end of it, the judge said, we have a tradition in Pakistan when we have famous people before the court, we get our photo taken with them. I looked across at Mark Taylor, and there was no way known he was going to have his photo taken with this judge. So I had to impassioned objection with absolutely no substance, saying we didn't want to get our photo taken. quite amusing when I look back on it, Michael, but it was deadly serious at the time. So the Pakistanis were upset that Mark Waugh hadn't advised them that he'd been fined and Shane Warne hadn't been fined. They insisted they come back to Pakistan to give evidence. They didn't. We organised for the Pakistan inquiry to come to Australia.
This is a saga, Mel.
It's a saga. Pakistan inquiry comes to Australia. We hire a courtroom in the federal court. We take down the photo of the Queen and put up a photo of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, and the hearing goes on in Australia, and Shane Warne and Mark Waugh and a few others give evidence there. So you talk about, did it help being a lawyer? It did help being a lawyer.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Green's List, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Green's List believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
You love the job as CEO of Cricket Australia. You say it's the best job in Australian sport. And yet after 4 years, you resigned to become CEO of the International Cricket Council. Why did you do that?
Again, Michael, I look back on that. It was a difficult decision. I think the challenge, having emerged late in life as a full-time sports administrator, the opportunity to run a world sport was too good to miss. And I knew that if I didn't do it then, so at this stage I'm 52, if I didn't accept the offer then, someone else would get it and that would not come up again. I wouldn't have that opportunity. So it was a very difficult decision. And it involved leaving Australia. I have 3 daughters. The youngest was about 20, just finishing university, so it was a difficult time.
Just to go back to a structural issue, Mel, so we understand exactly how all the pieces fit together. What is the role of the ICC? I mean, is it a governing body with supreme powers? What does it do and how does it have any form of control over Pakistan, India, England, Australia, South Africa, etc.?
Yes, it is the governing body, and all of the governing bodies in world sport have different levels of power. In those days, cricket had a good deal of power. It was largely commercial power, so the ICC, it was an organisation, as are all the others, that consisted of its members. So there were 10 what were called full members, the test-playing countries at that stage, and about 90 other members, so countries that played a good level of cricket through to the countries that played very little cricket but were members of ICC. And ICC ran international cricket. It was played under the laws of the game but under the ICC regulations. ICC provided the umpires and the referees, the disciplinary process. It ran international events, so World Cups and other events increasingly, those events increased during my time. So as far as any sporting body can run a world sport, ICC was reasonably powerful. I think it's less powerful these days for a number of reasons, but at that time it was powerful, and its power was emerging because big dollars were starting to come into the game. TV rights increased massively over that period, and that was a big influence in ICC creating more power.
Were legal skills a help in negotiating media rights and things of that nature?
Yes, a media rights deal is complicated enough in Australia. When you're doing a worldwide media rights deal, it has many moving parts, and each of those parts is a contract. The head contract for a media rights deal in those days was probably 150 pages. Now it would be more than that because there are so many other forms of media that have to be included or excluded or separated or divided or whatever it is. The issue for me, and towards the end of my time at ICC, I led a team that negotiated a $1 billion TV deal. The big issue was to avoid being sued. And we were dealing with Indian broadcasters where their existence sometimes depended on whether they had good cricket content during that period. And they were competing. So the process was exhaustive. Had some very expensive London lawyers working on the drafting, and a high-powered team. We toured the world. We went to India many times to meet with broadcasters and explain what was happening. The format we adopted was quite challenging in the end. The contract was a standard contract. They had to insert 3 parts to it. They had to put the name of the company that was bidding, the region they were bidding for, and the dollar amount they were prepared to bid, and then they had to sign it, and that was all. Then they had to give that to a forensic accountant who sealed it in their presence. They signed it, he put it into a safe, and he opened that in front of the board. Now, that was the end of a process that took 12 months. We managed to do that deal with some very aggressive Indian broadcasters, and we didn't get sued, so I was quite pleased about that.
I thought I'd read somewhere that you said that with certain parties you dealt with, once the contract was signed, sealed and delivered, that was the end of the process, whereas with other parties you were dealing with, the signing, sealing and delivering of the contract was only the start of negotiations.
It was a stage of the negotiations. If we're dealing with some Indian businessmen there, that related to the one I recall specifically was a mobile phone deal. So we must have been selling media rights to mobile phones. So it was probably, I think it might have been worth 100 million, something like that. And 3 parties had bid for it in sealed bids. And the winning party realised at the end of that they'd offered too much because the others hadn't offered as much. So they'd won the bid. They went back and reported to their chairman. Their chairman was very unhappy, and they came back and tried to renegotiate it because they would lose face with their chairman would lose face with everyone else. And I'd learnt by that stage that the Australian way of doing business, of banging the table and pointing to the contract and riding roughshod over them, and that's not fair to Australian businessmen, but that didn't work. So I had to work my way through that, and they ended up paying, but they needed to have that further negotiation several times to try to see if there's any way of reducing the amount that was paid. And that was part of a learning experience of negotiating in different cultures where things were done differently, and to try to bring a level of Western security and certainty to those deals was unusual for them. I think they'd be better at it now, but in those days, 25 years ago, it wasn't quite as obvious.
There must have been many big personalities and, dare I say, big egos on the board of the International Cricket Council.
Yes.
Was it difficult to deal with them? I mean, were you able to corral them and control them and to get them to move in one direction together?
It was difficult. It depended a lot on the personality of the chair at the time, and there were three men who were chairman while I was there. 4, in fact. One died. The personalities were, if I can just give you the sort of titles that we had there. There was one stage there was a lord from England, a knight from New Zealand, the son of a Maharaja from India, some judges, some politicians, an army general. They were high-powered. They'd risen to be the chair of their board, their cricket board in their country, which was an important role. And when they came together, they could be quite fractious. They could be difficult. English was often not their first language, so that was difficult, although they were all pretty good. At one stage, an army general came to one of the meetings, and I had a couple of conversations with him. I was quite convinced he'd never been to a cricket match. Yes, they were difficult. The method that we adopted was to give them very sound, detailed briefing papers, to give them to them 2 weeks in advance, and to write a 1-page executive summary. So they might get, for a board meeting which happened 4 times a year, they might get 100 pages. But there would be 10 executive summaries. If they only wanted to read the executive summaries, that would tell them what they needed to know. So they were done in a lever arch file. They were wrapped up in brown paper, and they were couriered to their home 14 days ahead of the meeting. I recall one man turning up, pulling out his brown paper wrap lever arch file of papers and taking the brown paper off it at the meeting. So that was disheartening, that you worked very hard to help them. And this guy, he'd been in the press saying what he was going to do at the meeting. He hadn't even read the papers. So that was disheartening. But that was an outlier. Generally, they were a fascinating group when they came together. Every now and then, the chair would lose control of the meeting, and it happens in all meetings, but it was more prone to it where there'd be a group or a faction or one or a strong voice would lead them down a path that I didn't want them to go and the chair didn't want them to go. That was difficult. Sometimes you could bring them back on course, sometimes we couldn't.
And all this time you're living overseas?
Yes.
London originally and then the UAE?
Yes, ICC initially was based in London. My office was at Lord's Cricket Ground, so I think back on that. I've just watched a cricket match from Lord's, and I walked in there, not every day because I was away a lot, but when I went to the office, you walk into Lord's Cricket Ground, talk to the groundsmen who were preparing the nursery oval, talk to the gatekeeper. What a place to work. It was amazing. We had tax issues. This is a little bit complicated, but might appeal to the tax lawyers. We couldn't get tax exempt status in England, so we ran our commercial activities from Monaco. And for 4 years, I had to go to Monaco once a month for 3 or 4 days. Now, early on, that was quite that was delightful. In fact, I had to get up very early that day, so it was a 4 o'clock start, a taxi to the station, train to the airport, catch the plane to Monaco, driver back to Nice, a driver from Nice to Monaco. I'm the only person I know who's ever said, "I'm sick of going to bloody Monaco," but it did happen. And then after 3 years, because of the tax issues with tax status, that board I talked about earlier decided that we would leave England and we would seek tax-exempt status somewhere else in the world. And I then had the task of visiting countries like Ireland and Switzerland and Singapore and Malaysia and the UAE and a couple of other countries that were offering sports organisations tax-exempt status. The UAE offer was excellent. It's a great place for cricket headquarters. It's 3 hours from Mumbai, closer to England, South Africa, Australia, not bad for the West Indies. So we moved to Dubai in 2005. At that stage, I think we took about 30 staff with us. And what was good there is we employed a lot of local workers there, most of whom were Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lankan. So we had a multicultural office. If you walked in there, it looked more like a cricket office than we did when we were in London.
Mel, during your time as CEO of the International Cricket Council, corruption was still a major issue for cricket, and you had help from an English policeman or a former English policeman named Paul Condon.
Yes, corruption was the biggest issue. We set up a very detailed framework, an anti-corruption unit that involved educating players. Lots of work went into that. It cost a lot. Paul Condon was the former head of Scotland Yard. He was a brilliant man. He subsequently became Lord Paul Condon, one of Tony Blair's people's peers. So he sat in the House of Lords. He was brilliant. He ran a team of largely English policemen who worked all around the world to put in place security protocols to minimise the impact of corruption. It was great working with him.
Then in 2008, after I think 7 years with the ICC, you finish.
Yes.
Why? Maybe not so happily.
It wasn't happy, Michael. My time at the ICC was happy. It was issues rich. There were lots of things happening there, with particularly corruption and India, the emergence of India. And I'd always had a difficult relationship with the Indian administrators. One of my proudest claims to fame is I've been burnt in effigy many times in India, and it's not difficult to get burnt in effigy if you're picking on the Indian cricket team, and apparently I was. But so I had a difficult relationship with India. I got involved in a dispute with Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had been a troubled cricket nation for many years. It was the height of the Mugabe regime. The white farmer issue had come and gone. England was very upset about the things happening in Zimbabwe. It became apparent that a lot of money that ICC was sending to Zimbabwe as one of its test playing countries, so millions of dollars, had been misappropriated. And that wasn't surprising in itself in the difficult times in Zimbabwe. And I went there about 10 times. It's a difficult country. I sought the permission of the board to carry out an inquiry. KPMG did a very detailed inquiry where they could show that a couple of $1 million had been misappropriated. They could see where it had come in. They couldn't tell where it had gone. And there were all sorts of issues with currency exchange, and it was a very complicated situation. I brought that to the board. Zimbabwe said, that's enough. You've carried out the investigation. There's no allegation against anyone in Zimbabwe cricket. That's the end of the matter. Together with Sir John Anderson, who was the New Zealand chairman, chairman of the Ethics Committee, he and I wanted to take that further. I got into an argument then with South Africa and Zimbabwe, and Kenya was on the board as one of the other countries at this stage. So I'd alienated Africa. India were quite happy that I was in trouble with Africa. They jumped in. Pakistan joined. The West Indies joined. And suddenly at a meeting where I wasn't present, a meeting in India, there was a newspaper article saying I'd been sacked. It took a little while for that to play out, but yes.
Can I ask, who was chairman of the ICC at the time?
a man called Ray Marley, who was a South African, and I'd fallen out with him. That hadn't helped either. I'd fallen out with him over this issue. He was short-term chairman who'd replaced another South African who died. Was a little bit out of his depth. He tried hard, but I'd fallen out with him badly. So I knew I was on borrowed time.
Over what you would consider to be embezzlement, I guess, of ICC funds.
Yes. I don't think we would have ever found out where the money had gone, but I wasn't happy just leaving it where it was. So suddenly the numbers are against me. I was due to finish in 2 months anyway. I'd had a 3-year contract. I'd lasted 7. I was going to finish and come back to Australia. 2 months to go. I'm sacked. I'm put on gardening leave. I went gardening in Egypt. I cruised down the Nile with my wife. I went gardening in Scotland, played some very good golf. But it was a difficult finish to what had been a good time, where I'd seen a lot of change. I'd made a lot of friends, and I'd lived through a period where world sport changed rapidly, where we don't quite give it enough credit. The TV rights that are now have come into sport are driving sport. We see it in Australia with the big sports who've got lots of TV money. The little sports have got no money. The small sports have got no money, and they're struggling. They can't keep up. That all happened over that time. I lived through that. It was fascinating.
Were you going to finish with the ICC, and at the end of that 2 months,
yes,
you were going to come back to Australia? So yes. It was inconvenient, but not really a problem.
It was embarrassing as much as anything. It was inconvenient. I look back on it and think, would I have done anything differently? No. The people representing South Africa at that stage, they led the fight. There was a judge from South Africa. He didn't like me. I didn't like him. And that was the opportunity to embarrass me and to stop the investigation into Zimbabwe, which they then stopped.
Looking back then and looking now, are you happy with the way what you did back then and where it's led the ICC to be, or world cricket to be now?
A lot of the commercial work we did in that period set ICC up to run big events that fund many of the countries other than India. What happened in that period is India became a massive superpower. It's population-driven, a population now of 1.4 billion, massive number of television sets, eye-watering numbers for TV rights deals, so multiple billions of dollars. The Indian Premier League is massive, so India is all powerful. The deals we put in place over that time, they fund the rest of world cricket, or much of the rest of world cricket. We did a lot of work on corruption. We did a lot of work on the regulations that surround cricket. Technology emerged during those periods. We solved, to an extent, the issue of chucking. People will laugh at that, but we have solved the issue of chucking. So there was lots happening. As a sports administrator, I look back on it and say what a privilege it was to be involved in that at the time. It would have been better if some of the politics hadn't been involved there. There were lots of legal issues there. That it's amazing how of an event like a Cricket World Cup consists of a massive number of contracts. So you've got contracts with hosts, contracts with broadcasters, sponsors, the cricket boards. You fill up, in the days when we had filing cabinets, for a Cricket World Cup there would be contracts that would fill one drawer of a big filing cabinet, massive 100-page contracts. And you hope that when you put them in there you never had to pull them out again, because if you had to pull them out again you were in trouble. So issues like ambush marketing and geo-blocking with TV, they were massively complicated. I learnt so much. It was a brilliant time to be involved in cricket.
And then we'll come back to humble old Melbourne. You come home and you bring together the two elements of your career, the law and sport, and you lecture at Melbourne Uni in sports law. Did you enjoy being a lecturer? And what did you actually lecture in?
There was a very good sports law program at Melbourne University run by a man called Hayden Opie, who's an outstanding sports lawyer. He and I and two other guys, James Patterson and Robert McDonald, lectured in different configurations of us, lectured in a subject called sports law, entities and governance. So we were talking about the entities that make up sport and the governance of sport. It was a Masters of Law subject in an intensive program, so we do it every second year, 5 days from 1 o'clock to 6:30, so a 5.5-hour lecture. maybe 15 to 20 master's students in the room who were paying a significant amount to the university to do this course. So to keep them interested for 5.5 hours for 5 days, Hayden and Rob and James would lecture the black law. They'd talk about this structure and that structure and whatever. And every now and then when things got dull, I'd pop up and tell a war story about this is how it works and this is what you need to know. And at the time, I was deputy chairman of Golf Australia, chairman of Cycling Australia. I was on the board of Richmond Football Club, a couple of other sporting jobs. So I had a good exposure to the way sport worked. So it worked quite well. I made a number of friends from those. We might have run that course 8 times each 2 years for quite a long time. Lots of the people you see in the newspaper now who are involved in sport went through that course.
So let's draw a breath now and look back. 1966, you walk into Melbourne University Law School. In your wildest dreams, you could not have anticipated the career you have had.
I was a naive, frightened 17-year-old Michael when I walked in there. Never met a lawyer.
Can I just interject there? I walked in the same day as you.
You did.
You were not naive and you were not frightened. That is not true.
I was, yes. And I was the only person from Melbourne High School there. That was somewhat daunting. I've had a marvellous career.
Highlights in that career?
I think the time at Cricket Australia, those 4 years there, I could go back and pick out particular games and that sort of thing, which is pretty dull. But that was a career highlight, to go from being a volunteer sports administrator to being thrust into a well-paid job where part of the job was to go to the cricket 30 days a year. That was pretty good. Lots of issues to deal with that I felt I dealt with some of them quite well, some of them not quite so well. But that was a brilliant time of my career. But I look back on it and think I've been blessed to have been a sports-mad kid who by accident became a lawyer and then was able to make a fascinating career as a sports administrator at very high levels.
And what about the naive and frightened kids walking out of Melbourne High this year with no idea what their future will look like? What would you say to them? Aim
high, have an interesting life. And the kids these days, they have so many more options than we had in our day. But aim high, be prepared to take a risk. And I took a risk. You've sort of worked through that each of those changes at those 11-year periods, I was taking a risk. Be prepared to take a risk and be ready to go if the opportunity arises.
Malcolm, it's been fascinating to talk with you this morning. As someone who walked into that law school the same day as you did, I've loved hearing about your life and hearing about the different things you did, and I'm sure it will be the same for the people who listen. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. It's been my pleasure.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things we've talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks, subscribe, rate and review the show. Your host is former lawyer and Greens List clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced and edited by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. We're coming to you from the iconic Owen Dixon Chambers on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, and we are privileged to continue that discussion here today.